My name is Pat Caristo. I'm a licensed private investigator in New Mexico. I've been licensed for more than 25 years. My background is law enforcement. I started in the Philadelphia Police Department as an investigator, went to the University of New Mexico as a detective, and then worked at the Governor's Organized Crime Prevention Commission as an intelligence analyst and agent. In 1992, I was doing work for an attorney who was specializing in auto accident cases, and drive-by shootings became something that was of interest to him, in that there were some lawsuits that could be filed on behalf of families involved in drive-by shootings. And he asked me, the attorney asked me, to get the case information on the Kait and Arquette shooting that was being classified as a drive-by shooting. During the course of that, I was able to have access to some of the police reports. And as I was going through the police reports, I noticed some information about the scene that was of interest to me. And because I also teach investigation, I thought it would be an excellent exercise for my apprentice investigators to identify this man who had been found at the scene and was allowed to leave the scene and had never apparently been interviewed. So aside from what the attorney was doing, we used that as an exercise. How could we identify someone? And that's what we did. We identified the person and then did routine public record searches on his court record, the police record, and found out that this man that had been standing next to the car in which a girl lay dying had violent attacks against women, and just weeks before had been arrested for shooting target practice. Some years later, in fact 2 years later, I saw Mrs. Arquette on a television show, the Sally Jesse Raphael show, with some other mothers who were looking for answers in unsolved cases. And Mrs. Arquette had given a summary of what they knew about the case. And I found it surprising that she knew none of the information that I knew. So at the end of the Sally Jesse Raphael show, they gave an 800 number to say that if anybody had information, to call. I called, I gave them the information about the man at the scene, and shortly after that, the Arquette family representative contacted me to ask me how I knew that information. That began my involvement in the Kait and Arquette case. At the request of the Arquette family, we began now to take an organized look at the material and gather new information. In looking at the police reports, we again saw that there were omissions in the report and unanswered questions, but we began to do some diagramming and linking and raising the questions that we would ask. And one of them was to verify whether this man that we had identified was in fact the man at the scene. Coincidentally, the man that was at the scene was arrested on a very interesting case, a case in which he had committed a sexual act against his stepsister, and he was found guilty. And one of the things that he testified to was that he did it on purpose. He did the sexual assault on his stepsister on purpose so as to go to jail, so that he could be in jail to protect his younger brother who was in jail for another crime. The judge found him guilty and said, well, I'm going to put you in jail, but not in the same jail with your brother. Interestingly, very shortly, they were in the same prison and in adjoining cells. Aside from that, the man was in the Bernalillo County Detention Center, and I put in a request to interview him, and he agreed to be interviewed. Went down to the detention center and met with him. He was a very interesting person in that he was nothing like what I was expecting. He was attractive, articulate, and very willing to talk to me. He agreed that he was in fact the man that was at the Arquette crime scene, and he talked about the fact of driving there in his orange Volkswagen, and he saw the car up against the pole. He stopped and was looking at the car when a plainclothes officer drove up on the scene. The man we identified was named Paul Apodaca. The man in prison said yes, he was Paul Apodaca, and he was the man at the Caitlin Arquette crime scene. I asked Mr. Apodaca what he was doing at the crime scene. He said that he was on his way to his friend's house, who lived about 500 feet away. He gave me the name of his friend, Lee Padilla. He didn't give me the address, but he did describe the house and gave me permission to interview Lee Padilla. My purpose in interviewing this man was to see whether there was anything that Paul might have told him after leaving the scene that might be important to my investigation. As we talked some more, Paul then withdrew his permission for me to interview Lee because he said I was going to Lee's house to purchase drugs, and I did purchase drugs. And Lee Padilla's brother is a police officer, so perhaps he would not talk to you. I asked Paul Apodaca if he had already used drugs to try to establish whether or not his recollection of what he saw and did at the scene was clear. He said he had not used the drugs yet, but that he did purchase them from Lee Padilla. I asked Paul Apodaca if he had seen anybody else around at the time he was there. He said no, no one else was there at the scene but him. Because the police had been looking for a Volkswagen Bug, and Mr. Apodaca told me that he had been driving a Volkswagen Bug, I'd asked him if he'd seen any other bugs making what was described by police as a U-turn. He said if anybody made a U-turn, it would have been me. I then asked him who was with him at the time, and that was the one time he got defensive. He said, nobody was with me. Who said anybody was with me? That section of the interview was so inconsistent with the pleasant interchange of information that we were having. The other time he reacted was he wanted to know how I had found him. He seemed to be surprised that I could have found him. One of the reasons I asked Mr. Apodaca to draw me a diagram of what his understanding of the scene was and his involvement of the scene was the information that a Volkswagen Bug was seen coming from the scene area within moments after some neighbors had heard shots fired. That Volkswagen Bug was said to have come north on Arno, pulled into a dirt lot, make a U-turn, return back to Lomas, having turned off its lights, and ran the stop sign at Lomas and went west on Lomas. The actions of that Volkswagen was interesting from several standpoints. One of them was the police report said it was a dirt lot. I made the assumption that it was a dirt lot, but when I went to the scene, it was in fact an established building with a large front parking lot, a large rear parking lot, and a gate leading to the back of the building. The building had a physical address written right on it, 824 Arno, and a name of the company. I found it interesting that that part was omitted, and I began to look at that location, who was there, was the Volkswagen perhaps trying to head into 824 Arno, but because the gate may have been closed, that's why it made the U-turn. I was also interested in that location because it had a very large dumpster right beside where this Volkswagen Bug would have made the U-turn. I wondered if that dumpster had been checked for weapons or other evidence. That became a major part of the investigation. This location, the actions of the Volkswagen Bug, this man at the scene called Paul Apodaca. The location at 824 Arno had been the subject of a lawsuit, and we were able to obtain the information from the civil lawsuit. In that civil lawsuit, it referred to the fact that that location was a place where Albuquerque police officers hung out after hours, and it provided some names of some of those officers, and that began another set of connections to people connected to the Caitlin Arquette case. The business was a radiator shop. but it had a reputation for being a chop shop. It had a place where after hours activities were going on, possibly some insurance fraud, and I was able to find out that two key people to what I was looking at were frequenters of that location, one of them being Peter Clunk. Peter Clunk was a man killed by the Albuquerque Police Department just months before the Caitlin Arquette case. The police officer who was involved in the shooting of him was Matt Griffin. That officer also hung out at 824 Arno. All of that became part of something that was burgeoning out of a mapping of persons, locations, and activity that were moving well beyond what was being classified as a random drive-by shooting. Part of the work that NIA does is we investigate unsolved homicides for the families of homicide at no charge to the families. And we had looked at the Peter Clunk murder case or shooting case because the family felt that it was not a clear-cut shooting by police. And in fact, it was a very controversial shooting. So the involvement at 824 Arno within months of Caitlin's being killed, and because we had found information that might have linked Peter Clunk to people that knew Caitlin, brought 2 or 3 cases together in our work. Matt Griffin was interesting in that when you look at the news coverage of the Caitlin Arquette case, you see the coverage of Matt Griffin being taken in for arraignment because he was arrested for bank robberies on duty as the Ninja Bandit and for also killing a gentleman that was also linked to the people we were identifying in this developing case.